In the past year, the ice cream company Ben & Jerry's was accused of terrorism. Actress Emma Watson was called an anti-Semite. Actor Mark Ruffalo faced virulent attacks on social media, and a full-page ad in the New York Times portrayed musician Dua Lipa and models Bella and Gigi Hadid superimposed over an image of a Hamas rocket. What do they all have in common? Speaking out in support of Palestinian rights. But the backlash isn't limited to high-profile companies or even celebrities. In recent years, there have been hundreds of cases involving censorship and silencing of those in the West who advocate for Palestinians. Is the label of anti-Semite being used to suppress voices calling for human rights? Joining me now to discuss this are Dima Khalidi. She is founder and director of Palestine Legal, and Barry Trachtenberg. He's a professor and historian of Jewish history at Wake Forest University. Thank you both for joining us on UpFront. Dima, let me start with you. How is it that standing up for the human rights of one group of people, Palestinians, has come to be equated with anti-Semitism?
Well, I think we have to understand that this has been something that's decades in the making. We're talking about a state, Israel, that has done everything in its power to prevent a people that it occupies, that it has dispossessed, that it oppresses, that it practices apartheid against. It's done everything in its power to prevent Palestinians from gaining self-determination, from gaining their human rights. And so one of the main tactics that, again, has been decades in the making is an effort to smear anyone and everyone who questions Israel's foundation on the dispossession of Palestinians as anti-Semitic. The other pillar of that, as you noted, is to smear them as terrorists. If they resist, if they, question Israel's practices. So we have to see it in this broader and much longer historical context of the ways that Israel has been trying to repress growing solidarity movements with the Palestinian people. And this effort to specifically redefine anti-Semitism in a way that encompasses basically any criticism of Israel has really gained ground in the last several years, in particular, to the extent that this definition has been codified in laws around the world, including in the U.S. and Europe especially.
Barry, backlash against celebrities and companies makes the headlines, of course, but there's also widespread retaliation against those who are less high profile, including really especially college students, academics. How has this issue affected campuses and scholars?
What this does is it forces students and professors to really self-censor in profound ways. We've had a number of high-profile cases in the academy of professors who have lost their jobs, been denied job offers, who have faced regular assaults on account of their scholarship, which is peer-reviewed, it's accepted by the profession itself, but very often it's outsiders, potential donors to universities, supporters of Israel, who mount large media campaigns to try to get those professors defunded, to get them stripped of their titles and get them kicked out of the universities. Student groups also face this. At Fordham University, there's a group of students who've been advocating for justice in Palestine for years who cannot get their organization formally recognized by the university because the message has gone out that they are anti-Semitic, when there's no hint of that whatsoever. And there's many Jews who want to participate in this movement who are also banned from doing that work.
Dima, to Barry's point, one of the things that is remarkable about the backlash is that it has affected even Jewish people. Even Jewish people have been accused of anti-Semitism. Senator Bernie Sanders, who is Jewish and lost family in the Holocaust, he's been accused of anti-Semitism based on his view that the U.S. should not be an apologist for the Israeli government, as well as for his support of Palestinian rights. A Likud minister accused Natalie Portman, who is Israeli and American, of engaging in borderline anti-Semitism when she declined to go to Israel to accept an award out of protest against former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's policies. What do you make of the fact that even Jewish people are being censored and accused of anti-Semitism?
Well, as Barry alluded to, this really is about policing, first and foremost, Palestinian expressions of their own history, their own experiences, their own reality under Israeli oppression. And it also functions to make pariahs of anyone who stands in solidarity with them, who expresses support for Palestinian freedom, who criticizes Israel's own practices. And so I think it's part of the current developments over the last 10 or so years where you've seen increasing questioning within the Jewish community of Israel's practices. And that's in large part due to a strong grassroots Palestine solidarity movement that has really integrated Palestine into the progressive movement.
Barry, there's also a generational piece to this as well. We're seeing divisions grow between younger and older generations of Jewish Americans as well over Israeli politics. One Jewish writer for Rolling Stone put it, she said she was raised to, quote, unequivocally support Israel, but she also explains that because the conflict is defined by, quote, either you support Israel or you support its destruction, it's difficult to, quote, even consider the other side. Do you see a move toward younger people, younger Jewish Americans in particular, supporting critiques of Israel, and if so, why?
It's happening, I think, because of the gap between sort of the promise of Israel and the reality of Israel has just grown so great. And as younger generations are paying more attention to questions of racism in America, of systematic oppression of people of color, of engaging in issues of queer rights, people recognize that there can't be this exception for Israel. And my students, when they come into my class that I teach on the history of Zionism, many of them have gone to Israel on these free trips that are provided to college students, for Jewish college students, called Birthright. They've been raised going to Jewish summer camps. They've been raised having a full-on sort of Zionist education, but they come to my class really troubled by what they see on the news, right? So I had many students in my class this fall who were really worried because at the time when they were signing up for classes last spring, there was the takeover of Sheikh Jarrah and communities in Sheikh Jarrah just outside of Jerusalem. And students signed up for my class because they wanted to know more about this history. So I think larger numbers of students are starting to engage in this question critically, and they're looking to professors to teach that work. But very often, teachers are sort of held back. They're restrained from teaching this kind of history because the penalties for doing so can be so high.
Dima, anti-Semitism is on the rise with sharp increases in anti-Semitic incidents and acts of violence in recent years. At the same time, so is the suppression of Palestinian advocacy. In 2020 alone, your organization documented at least 213 incidents of suppression, including smear and harassment campaigns for those supporting Palestinian rights. What are the consequences of restricting the range of opinions allowed about Israel and conflating anti-Semitism with criticism of Israeli policies?
The consequences are quite stark. This is about people's reputations, about people's jobs, about the way that we can operate and talk in a civil society. What we see at Palestine Legal, hearing from hundreds of people every year, is that there is what we have termed a Palestine exception when it comes to free speech in this country. And it's just the tip of the iceberg, right? When we look at the ways that Israel and Israel advocacy groups here in the US have attacked Palestine advocacy through harassment campaigns or legislation that is curtailing our right to boycott for Palestinian rights, these are templates for how the far right in this country is attacking other movements as well. The same kind of legislation is now being used to attack the environmental justice movement, to attack the efforts to curtail gun rights, the proliferation of guns in the US. We already see legislation being used against other movements. So we know that Palestine might be easier because it's a less popular opinion to support Palestinian rights in general. It might be easier to suppress speech for Palestinian rights, but it really is the kind of icebreaker for the curtailing of and the undermining of all of our First Amendment rights. So it starts with Palestine, but it doesn't end there. And that's why we all have to care about this.
Dima, Barry, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront. That's our show, UpFront. We'll be back next week.